Let's go back to the politics of the day and the response to coronavirus. With me, Troy Bramston, senior writer and columnist with The Australian. Troy, as always, I appreciate your time. Let's start with really what is going to be a pivotal couple of, not just a few weeks, but months for this federal government and for the Prime Ministership of Scott Morrison. How do you see it right now?
Yeah, I think it is, Kieran. It's incredible to think that only a month ago we wouldn't be talking about a stimulus package or the budget deficit going back into the red, but that's exactly what we're looking at the moment. Scott Morrison has a twin crises on his agenda to deal with. Obviously trying to stop the spread of what is likely to be an international pandemic with the coronavirus, and also with trying to stimulate the economy to stop a slide into recession. There are already some economists who think that we've had negative growth in the first quarter of this year, and there will be another negative quarter of growth in the June quarter, which gives you a technical definition of a recession. So, you know, it doesn't get much more difficult for prime ministers or for governments, coming also after the bushfires and the drought and of course the floods in some parts of Australia at the start of the year. So it's been a torrid political start to the year, but some very big policy challenges that the government has to deal with.
Huge. And in terms of the response, it's complicated by the critique of the former Labor government's response in the face of the GFC, Troy.
Well, it is, and I think we need to be mindful this is not the same economic crisis that we faced in 2008-9. That was essentially a crisis within the financial system. This is not a crisis within the financial system, and so the response is going to be and must be different from government. But the idea that the government could give out huge sums of money, run big infrastructure programs such as the school hall and school building program, or the Pink Bats program, the government is not going to go down that path. What we're hearing, of course, as you've been reporting, is a much sort of targeted stimulus package that focuses on keeping businesses operating, protecting jobs, and there is a possibility of some kind of cash payment being made to keep stimulating the economy. And it's worth reminding, of course, that meanwhile the Reserve Bank has just cut interest rates last week down to 0.5%, the official rate, and they're tipped to reduce them again down to 0.25%. And so that is now clearly at emergency levels, and that hasn't done enough to stimulate the economy, so the government's going to come in. But the government has to deal with demand and supply problems in the economy, and so getting the balance right is going to be very, very difficult.
We are facing obviously a lot of concern and panic in the markets and elsewhere, in the shopping market, the shopping aisles, as we've seen, the supermarkets, Troy. But if the government does, preside over the first recession in a number of decades, how damaging is that in a political sense for the government?
Well, look, it can be very damaging, but of course the last recession in 1990-91, the Hawke government was re-elected with interest rates over 15%, and the Keating government was re-elected with unemployment over 1 million, over 11%. So, look, it's not impossible for this government, if they do preside over a recession, that they're gone, they're done and dusted. It just places an emphasis on the response, and voters need to have confidence in their Prime Minister, in their Treasurer, and in difficult times voters will tend to look at governments as the devil they know rather than the devil they don't know. So there's always a risk in changing government. So politically this is obviously far from the government's mind, but it can work in their favour. But it requires strong leadership and it requires an effective response. And as you say, Kieran, where there's a lot of panic out there and uncertainty on the markets that are tumbling today, or in the supermarkets as people are fighting over toilet paper, they look to their leaders to provide reassurance and certainty and make sure they've got the right policy responses.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Sometimes it can benefit a leader if they do step up, and the better the devil you know perspective when it comes to politics. But what from Morrison, what from the Prime Minister does he need to prove over the next few days and weeks? Would you like to see something like an address to the nation or something of that sort?
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea. That idea has been floating around. I've heard today, and that's a good one. I think Scott Morrison's handled the coronavirus very effectively. It's in sharp contrast to, frankly, how he handled the bushfire crisis over the summer. He's learnt lessons from that, and good prime ministers do learn lessons, and the voters, I think, are watching him very, very carefully. So, yes, an opportunity to continue to show reassurance, to show authority, to show that he knows what he's doing, and he's in command of the situation, and he's also showing empathy with people that, may have to self-isolate and not be able to go to work, kids that have got to stay home from school, and the general sort of fear and panic that clearly is out there in some sections of the community. This is a moment for prime ministerial leadership, and so far I think on this issue Scott Morrison's done a good job.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Troy, and particularly in the context of what was a very difficult summer through the fires to then dust himself off and get on with what is now a massive crisis internationally, but also with flow-on effects here, I think is a credit to him thus far. But it's only thus far, and we're talking about budget, we're talking about stimulus this week, we're talking about trying to stay out of a recession. So the tests in that position, as is the way, keep on coming, Troy.
Yeah, and the tests are going to keep on coming. And it's important to get the policy response right, but also get the leadership projection right. It's very interesting to see Donald Trump. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump, I'll say that openly. But frankly, the way he's handled the coronavirus in the US has led even Republicans and his supporters very disappointed. I mean, he's questioned official advice to the US government about the health impacts. He's questioned, different elements of the response, waged in with his opinions. And we haven't seen that, of course, from Scott Morrison, who's been very clearly following the advice from the experts and being very cautious and being careful, but projecting a sense of authority and credibility when he's talking about these issues. But the rubber's going to hit the road with this stimulus response, and the memories of the Rudd Swan's response, as you mentioned at the outset of this segment, Kieran, is very much front of mind for people. And the government is looking for, I think, a well-targeted, timely, but temporary intervention into the economy to try to keep it afloat, to stop it from slipping into that possible recession. They're not looking at baking in spending and big amounts of money that could take, a decade or two to repay.